Hello everybody, my name is Dratnos, and welcome to my guide to the Necrotic Affix. So what is Necrotic? Necrotic is an affix that means that mobs in the dungeon will apply this dot to targets when they successfully melee attack them. So the dot is pretty small. It's not 0 like it says on the tooltip, but it scales with M+ level. But per stack, it's actually a relatively insignificant amount of damage. The main thing that Necrotic Rot does is it stacks a healing and absorb received reduction on the target. This dot stacks all the way from 1 stack up to 99 stacks, and obviously once you're at 50 stacks, you're completely unhealable, and you don't get any healing or absorb benefits from either yourself or your healer as a tank. So that's the real problem, is once it starts to stack to a point where you're unhealable, and then the dot damage is also quite significant at that level, so you're pretty likely to fall over dead. So what Necrotic ends up meaning is that tanks have to kite a lot, they have to focus on finding good ways to reset their stacks, and in fact, each tank has a bit of a different toolkit to let them best deal with this affix. So to help explain that to you, I've brought in a special guest for this next segment. So let's start off by looking at our S-tier Necrotic tank, which is in fact your main spec, the Brewmaster Monk. So one of the things about Brewmaster is that they're really good at kiting, right? And Necrotic is an affix that is often about kiting, so the fact that they are good at that ends up making them really good for dealing with this affix when you need to kite. But Brewmaster also brings a variety of other useful things with the kit, right? There's the leg sweep, the ring of peace, combined with the high dodge chance, which means that on single target, Brewmaster can reset stacks in a much more consistent way and stacks much slower than everybody else does. How do you feel as a Brewmaster playing in Necrotic?
They definitely bring a lot of tools that are capable of handling both large packs and the single target. I would say that you hit the nail on the head. Leg sweep and ring of peace are both ways that you can disengage from packs that are still being actively fought, as well as their extreme mobility, letting them basically just completely run around the pack without having to put themselves in danger of running too far away from the healer or running into a different pack. They have a dodge chance from their mastery, which lets them, like you said, stack up much slower. They're able to reset on a single target pretty easily. However, there is a danger with Brewmaster in that a lot of their damage comes over time. As they are running around, they'll still have their stagger mechanic ticking down on them. And since Necrotic does a little bit of damage, if they have started kiting too late, they will find themselves in a situation where they're taking damage that they literally can't be healed through, and they'll die. So
yeah, they'll just be a dead person walking for 5 or 10 seconds and then fall over.
Absolutely. So the biggest, most important thing as a Brewmaster is to know when that breaking point is, when you need to start kiting, because if you do it too late, you're going to be punished severely for it. However, they do have, like you said, many tools to deal with this. So if you are paying attention and you've gotten used to the affix a little bit, you're definitely able to make plays around it pretty consistently.
All right, so down then in our A tier, second best set of tanks we have for this, we actually have 2 tanks in the A tier. The first is Blood Death Knight, and the primary reason for this is Anti-Magic Shell being a 1-minute cooldown that really effectively lets you handle the dot from Necrotic, right? You can fire that off and you're basically going to reset your stacks every time.
You can definitely reset your stacks. It's a little bit more punishing than it was in Legion, where typically you would wear the legendary cloak, which increase the duration to 10 seconds. Which is the duration of the Necrotic Rot debuff. So it basically, as soon as you popped it, as long as you weren't breaking that shield, guaranteed to reset your stacks. It's a little more finicky now. What you want to make sure you're doing is, they do have a slow of their own. If you take Grasp of the Dead, which basically everyone does, let's Death and Decay put an extreme slow on the entire pack for a short duration, letting you get away from them for a few seconds and let that debuff tick down to about 5 seconds. Then you can pop your anti-magic shell and go back into the pack, which they do need to do. Their damage is not great, and especially when they're on the run, they're not able to do any of their damage, so they need to make sure that they're able to keep in there and keep doing damage so that they can maintain threat. And being able to use anti-magic shell to reset their stacks is very big. Same thing in single target. It's a little more RNG in that they need to actually get to that point where they're at 5 seconds left on the debuff, or they need to time it with melee swings, which is doable, but a little more finicky.
Yeah, and you also have Dancing Rune Weapon, which is another way to increase your parry chance. So like on single target in particular, that's a good way to reset stacks, probably, unless you're very unlucky.
Absolutely. 40% increased parry chance. You have a very high chance to parry, especially in a single target. So you can definitely combine that and anti-magic shell to not necessarily guarantee, but give you a very good chance at resetting.
Now, the fact that Blood Death Knights do so much of their mitigation through healing themselves back up, is that a vulnerability with Necrotic?
It definitely is. When you're fighting a pack, generally speaking, a Death Knight's able to stay in there for a little bit, not the whole time, but as they're moving backwards, they can heal up with their death strikes, and chaining their cooldowns so that they're effectively healing themselves to full every few seconds. But with Necrotic, that definitely gives it some issues. I would say that the choices are, you either want to use your anti-magic shell early so that you can stay in there, do some damage, and keep healing early on through a pull, or you could use it as a reset so you can come back in later. However, it is definitely a vulnerability if you find yourself cornered, or if you've run out of ways to escape or mitigate a pack. You're going to be in serious trouble with Necrotic.
All right, so that's Blood Death Knights. Then in the A tier, we also have Protection Paladins. Protection Paladins are largely here due to their multiple cooldowns that they can use to reset. What are those cooldowns that they have at their disposal?
Well, they have Divine Shield, which every Paladin has. It's a 5-minute cooldown, makes them completely invulnerable to almost everything in the game. Obviously, there's some things that pierce that immunity, but Necrotic is not one of them. An important thing with Divine Shield is that it drops all threat for the duration of the shield. So generally speaking, you're going to see a Prot Paladin have a macro that cancels it instantly. So they'll use it and cancel it immediately just to remove those stacks. Otherwise, the pack is going to go wild and hit everyone else. They also have Blessing of Protection, which they can talent into an ability called Blessing of Spellwarding. It replaces that ability and makes it so that instead of a full physical immunity, they have a full magical immunity. And at current, that means that they can completely remove the Necrotic stacks without actually losing threat on the pack, unless there are casters in the pack.
Right, yeah. Anybody who's going to cast an ability like Lightning Bolt or whatever will not target a Paladin who's will not start casting on somebody who's got Blessing of Spellwarding active.
Correct, and it can be, you want to know which mobs those are, because if you spell ward yourself into the caster, then attacking someone that isn't you, I mean, depending on the strength of the cast, it could be very deadly for your group. So you want to make sure that you're both using it in the correct situation. But if someone is casting on a player in your group, you do have abilities to deal with it. Avenging Shield being one of the best interrupts in the game. You can have it up all the time, basically. It's not a melee interrupt either. It's got a 25 or 30 yard range, so it's a pretty strong ability to counter that particular interaction, but definitely do need to be careful there.
All right, then we have an empty B tier, no tanks there. Down in the C tier, we have Demon Hunter tanks, Vengeance Demon Hunters. Vengeance
doesn't have a reset in the way that any other tank does. And Brewmaster can do it through dodges. DK and Paladin have cooldowns, but Demon Hunter basically comes down to you are doing your damage and you are escaping when you have too high stacks. They aren't really taking damage from the Necrotic, so they can do it when they're pretty low health, but they need to get out of there. They don't have the option to just stay in there and reset while they're doing damage. That said, they do a lot of damage, so they're able to go in there, fight for a little while, and escape, and even do a little bit of their damage from range through their sigils and their dots.
Right, so the whole game is just go in, do damage, run away, and hopefully you can keep your threat on. And they are actually pretty good at that, but they're still doing a lot less damage than a tank that can stay in, and the group loses damage when the pack starts being kited like that. In D tier, we actually have a tank that has a very similar pattern with Trash, which is Protection Warriors. Like Havoc Demon Hunters, they do a ton of damage to Trash. They can go in, do damage for 10 seconds, and then they have to start kiting. The problem with Protection Warriors actually is on single target. Whereas Havoc has parry and dodge chances that'll let them reset stacks, or at least not stack up very quickly. Protection Warriors only really block to mitigate, and that doesn't actually stop Necrotic from stacking up. So on single target, they actually need to find a way to reset. So potentially kiting even on single target is something that you'll see protection warriors being forced to do more often, and that's why I put them down in the D tier. Is that a fair characterization, you think, of the class?
I think so. I think Vengeance and Prot are both pretty close in that regards, but I do agree in that Vengeance has a little bit more going for it. It'll still probably have to kite in single target, but it does have a bit higher chance at parrying through their demon spikes and dodging.
Right, and then down all the way at the F tier in the garbage can, we have the Guardian Druid. Why do Guardian Druids suck so much at this?
It's unfortunate too. They do dodge a lot more than any tank besides Brewmaster. However, they can't parry, and they have no strong kite ability at all. If they're to remain in bear form, which you don't necessarily have to do, but for some packs you do. If they're to remain in bear form, they're just walking basically. They have Stampeding Roar, which is a decent move speed buff for themselves and the group, as it were, but they don't have any cooldown to reset. They have Typhoon if they talent into it, which is nice. It lets you move the pack a bit away from you as you're kiting, but they don't have a slow like Paladins have Consecration slow, which is pretty great. And Vengeance Demon Hunters, if they're running Sigil of Chains, which they almost always will, if they're not using it at the beginning of a pack, they can use it as they're about to kite. That applies a very substantial slow. Druids don't have it. They lost their slow in Legion, and they've not been given anything to replace it, unfortunately.
So they just are at the mercy of their move speed and the rest of their group really helping them out in kiting.
Definitely so. They do have quite a few cooldowns to mitigate damage, but it's not really enough to make up for the lack of mobility and other resetting cooldowns that other tanks seem to have.
They may be better on single target than tanks like Protection Warriors, but Necrotic is much more of an issue, I think. I think it's fair to say that Necrotic is more of an issue on trash usually than on bosses, so how good a tank is at trash is really most of the reason that they're in their spot, that they are in this tier list.
Completely agreed. There are some exceptions. I would say I don't think I know of any of this expansion. In Legion, there were some dual wielding bosses that hit very quickly, and that could be a problem for some tanks where it wasn't really, for most bosses. But I don't think there are any like that in BFA that I can recall.
Yeah, the only thing that really jumps to mind is like Harlan Sweet's last phase when he gets the attack speed buff.
That is true. He will attack very quickly during that last phase, but he also dies very quickly in that last phase.
Right, yeah, and it is Necrotic, unless it's combined with Tyrannical, shouldn't be too bad in that sort of situation. Anyways, thanks so much for special guesting in this little segment here. I appreciate it. And where can people find you for tank content if you create any? Do you create any?
You can find me on my Twitch channel at twitch.tv/JasonXDRaffle. I'll be streaming there when we're pushing high keys. That's generally all I do is stream high keys, so if I'm streaming, it means we're doing high keys. I will also have a YouTube channel associated with that Twitch channel on my Twitch info page. You can find that on that website.
All right, thank you very much. But tanks aren't the only people that have abilities that are useful when dealing with Necrotic. The main types of abilities that are just good on everybody against Necrotics are any sort of displacement effect, so things like Typhoon, Shining Force, anything like that helps keep mobs off the tank and help them kite. All those abilities are good. Also stuns, AoE stuns is a good way to stop the dot from being applied to your tank for a couple seconds. It's a good way to start a pull. Either you can run in, use your AoE stuns while the tank builds threat, and then the tank can run out, or you can run in, tank can get some stacks, then you can use your AoE stun, and then the tank can run out during that AoE stun, and they can start building opening a gap between themselves and the mobs. So that's useful too. Single target stuns are also useful. Single target stuns are good. If a tank is kiting and there's one mob that's like about to catch up to them, that's a great spot to use something like a kidney shot on that mob or a cheap shot, or any other stun, Hammer of Justice, all of them. They all do the same thing. So I'm not going to talk specifically about any of those sorts of abilities. What I am going to talk about are a couple of abilities that stand out as particularly useful against Necrotic. And the first one is Force of Nature. So this is a talent that balanced druids can use. And it summons 3 little treants, and they taunt mobs around them. And Force of Nature is a very, very powerful cooldown just in all Mythic Plus, but particularly for Necrotic Week, Force of Nature just lets you you plop down those treants, and it's very likely that your tank can get a reset during that. It can help them kite if they want to, but the main thing it does is, yeah, just for those seconds, all those melee attacks are hitting those treants instead of the tank, and it's very easy for them to reset the stacks. So Force of Nature, I think, is the best utility brought by anybody that's not a tank against Necrotic. Another good one, of course, all slows are good against Necrotic. Any kind of slow is good, but the best slower in the game is the Frost Mage. And Frost Mage slows in particular let a tank start kiting very easily. The amount of slow speed means that you're not going to lose too much damage as mobs are being kited if they are slowed by, 85% or whatever the Frost Mage ridiculous percentage slow is. So that is another spec that is very, very good in Necrotic weeks. Any monk spec, so obviously the tank ring of peace we talked about being particularly useful, but all monk specs can actually talent into it. So your Windwalkers and your Mistweavers bring a great deal of utility with ring of peace too, because you put that down, it doesn't DR with your AoE stuns, and you can use it to reset stacks very consistently, very reliably, in addition to using it to help kite. So you can either have your tank stand in the ring of peace and use the ring, and then they just stand in the middle and their stacks reset during the ring of peace ideally, or you wait until they're about to reset and then you can use ring to guarantee that the reset goes off, or you can just use it as a kiting tool. You put it in a choke point and all the mobs keep bouncing against the ring of peace. You can keep doing damage efficiently to them while the tank is not getting meleeed and they're getting out of there. So that's a very useful ability too. Then there's a set of 3 specs that have the ability to taunt and immune. These are Arms Warriors with Die by the Sword, Havoc Demon Hunters with Netherwalk, and Retribution Paladins with Bubble. And all 3 of these specs have the ability on single target, if the tank needs to get a stack reset, they can taunt and immune and not have to kite. Every taunt is somewhat useful against Necrotic, with the kind of notable exception of the monk non-tank taunts, because those will actually speed the mob up and make it harder to kite. But so all the taunts are good at letting you kite and reset tank stacks that way. But there are some bosses where that's not possible. There are some bosses where that's annoying. And there are some just mini bosses, for instance, where that is also difficult. And in those cases in particular, these immune taunts really give you a breath of fresh air and a reset, get out of jail free button. So those are especially useful. Particularly, that's a really good combo on Necrotic Tyrannical or on Necrotic Fortified against really difficult mini bosses. And then the final set of abilities that I think are particularly of note against Necrotic are the big gap-closing abilities brought by somebody other than the tank. And these are Warlock Gateway and Priest Leap of Faith. And both of those abilities will let you get the tank from next to the mobs to really, really far away from the mobs in a single second. So those are notably useful to help start the kite. Your tank has 30 stacks or whatever and is just rotting away. And they don't have any ability that'll let them get out of there. If they start running, they're going to lose their mitigation and they're going to stop being able to heal themselves, or they're going to stop being able to prevent damage that's coming in on themselves. So you just get them out of there in one global. That's really useful. So those are the best abilities against Necrotic. Thanks for watching my guide to the Necrotic Affix. I hope you found something new in here. If you did, I'd appreciate it if you throw me a subscribe, maybe like the video, maybe comment, maybe share it to your friends that particularly, you have a friend that keeps having trouble with Necrotic Week. Well, this might be the video that could help them learn more. So that'd be cool. Thank you, and I'll see you for the next one.